So there we go. All right, so welcome everybody, and thank you for joining today. This is the Start Network FOREWARN community meeting, which is focused on flooding, and it's the Q3 meeting. We're continuing with the hazard theme. So yeah, welcome. Just a quick word on interpretation. And a couple of just reminders around Zoom. So for translation, there will be presentations in both English and French. It's the first time we're trying this, so please do bear with us a little bit. If you look for the globe icon in the bottom right-hand side of your screen, you can click there and then choose the English channel to hear the English version of the meeting. And then just quickly in French, so pour ceux qui parlent français, bonjour à tous. Vous trouverez en bas de vos écrans un petit icône du globe. Si vous cliquez là-dessous, vous pouvez accéder à l'interprétation en direct. Donc, c'est pour la première fois. Donc, il y aura des présentations en anglais et en français. Donc, si vous voulez écouter la version française, choisissez la chaîne française. Okay, hopefully that should be clear for everybody. But if I think one of the team is going to post the instructions for that in the chat, but do let us know if that's not working for you. The next point is just please do keep yourselves on mute if you can. So we do want this session to be as interactive as possible, but we were trying to avoid disruption if we can, as we have a very packed agenda. So if you aren't talking, please do keep yourselves on mute. We'd also ask you to pop your name and organisation, if you just rename yourself, including your organisation, to make that super clear so that we know who you are and can see who's speaking. And yeah, do make sure you say hello in the chat, reach out with any questions, comments and opinions, as I say, trying to make this as engaging as we can. So keep the conversation going in the chat there. And yeah, there are a whole load of people who you might recognise from the Start Network on the call. They might reach out to you directly, but also feel free to message anybody directly if you have any questions. So we have Anila, Ashraf, David, Ed, Leah, Marwa, Cindy, Saheno, Emily, all kinds of people. So please do feel free to message them directly with any questions as well. So just going through the agenda quickly. As with last time, we're having this in two parts. So the first focus will be on the Start Network, and the second half will focus on the wider FOREWARN community. Ashraf has taken up the job of timekeeper. As I say, we are quite tight for time today. We have a lot of really exciting speakers. So we do have just 10 minutes per update. So if you're speaking, Ashraf will give you a little reminder when you're about 1 minute from the end of your session, just to try and keep time. But with Start Network, we'll be thinking about what we've been working on when it comes to anticipating flooding. So looking at the Start Fund and the different DRS systems that are in the kind of process. So we have Emmanuel from DRC who will be speaking to us about their plans for predicting flooding. And also John from JBA who will be talking us through the model in Pakistan. We'll then be looking at what we can do together as a FOREWARN community and how the FOREWARN community can support members to anticipate flooding. So we'll hear from the Zambia and Mozambique Red Cross societies who will tell us about their learnings from the different early action protocol and some test activations that they've been working on. We'll also hear from Dr. Liz Stevens from the University of Reading and the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Centre about the use of global flood forecasting systems for anticipatory action. We'll have Imtiaz and Sumaya who will be talking about the FAO and Shufel project in Bangladesh. And then we'll also hear about strengthening urban preparedness in the Philippines. So as I say, quite a lot to cover. We are hoping to keep 20 minutes at the end for an open discussion and a bit of a Q&A. But please do add any questions in the chat as we go, and hopefully our speakers can respond to you as we go through. I'd just like to ask someone from the team to please just share the link to the full agenda in the chat box there so everyone can kind of keep track of where we're up to. And just to say that the team will stay on the line at the end for any questions that you might have. But yeah, please do be building those connections in the chat, and we will hope to have some time for questions at the end. So with that all said, just to hand over to Emily, who is the Head of Crisis Anticipation and Risk Financing here at Start Network. Emily, over to you for some welcome remarks.
Thank you, Millie. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. So great to see so many of you here. I'm always really inspired by these FOREWARN meetings because it feels like the number of people and the diversity of people tends to grow from meeting to meeting. So we've got humanitarian practitioners from all around the world. We've got academics here, people from the private sector and wider. So yeah, great to have everyone here today and also to be discussing flooding. I was actually listening to the radio yesterday and there was a program on the BBC in which a hydrologist, Hannah, from the University of Reading, so obviously Reading are speaking later in this meeting, was talking about the flooding that had happened over the summer in Mozambique, in Germany, in the US, and that had caused so much suffering and loss of life. And she said it really well. She was talking about the fact that when it comes to floods, we have this really great technology that can warn in advance. And yet we still see so many people suffer and so much loss of life. And she reminded us all of that important chain from early warning information going all the way through to early action, and that actually just having the technology itself, and no matter how precise it is, it's not enough, and that actually those kind of warnings and that information needs to be in the right format, in the right hands of the right people, and informing the right kinds of actions. And I think it's great that over this meeting, hopefully we're going to be hearing some of those examples of that chain itself and what it looks like and how it's working in different places. At the START network, I think you'll hear about examples from our two anticipatory approaches, from anticipation through the START Fund, which is obviously our global contingency fund that can release money very quickly and in anticipation of crises, and in which NGOs can raise alerts to it on the basis of forecast information on the ground. And I think we'll hear about some of that in the context of flooding. And also examples more from disastrous finance systems, where we actually take a slightly deeper approach, working with risk modeling and setting triggers and pre-agreed plans in advance and more predictable financing. And I think we'll hear about some of that in the context of Pakistan. So it's great to be having this discussion as a community. And it's a good moment to have this, not least because we have these examples that we can share between us, but also because there's increasing political momentum and interest around this, as evidenced, for example, with this radio program yesterday. Anticipation is becoming, something a bit less niche and a bit more mainstream in a good way. And there was a high-level event a few weeks ago organized by the UN together with the governments of Germany and the UK, in which there are a huge number of governments expressing support for this approach, so moving away from crisis reaction and towards more anticipation and calling for scale up. So yeah, looking forward to the discussion today, and I hope you enjoy it. I know I will, and I hope this will inspire and stimulate many further kind of collaborations and systems that will generate evidence that we can learn from.
Thank you very much, Emily. It's great to hear from you and to hear about all the exciting things that we have coming up. Just quickly before we jump into the presentations, just to remind everybody around the purpose of FOREWARN and why we are here. So FOREWARN is the forecast-based warning analysis and response network, and the purpose of this network is really, as you say, Emily, to bring together humanitarians and partners from outside the traditional sector into this community. So as you'll see from this diagram, which is kind of meant to represent FOREWARN, on the bottom left there we have the START Fund, which, as you mentioned, is the multi-donor pooled fund that we have, which is a mechanism for our 50+ members to access funding within 72 hours. And this is for response, but can also be used in advance of a crisis happening, which obviously requires the right information and data to be able to forecast these events. So FOREWARN was created to bring together, as I say, humanitarians and other multi-sectoral experts to make sure that we're able to forecast these events and to act before they take place. And the thematic clusters of experts that you see at the bottom left there all feed into START alerts and help that decision to be made. Then on the right, as we all know, data about a crisis really does need to come from those who are closest to it, who know the most about it. So we have the 5 FOREWARN pilots there. We have 4 countries up and running with their own clusters of experts, and hopefully DRC will be following soon. And then lastly, the FOREWARN community, so that wider circle there, that's all of us who are here in this meeting today. So it's a place for connections, for discussions, for advocacy and for sharing. Across the middle there, you can see we do have some funding available. So we have, of course, the Start Fund bottom left, but also Action for Analysis grants, tools for building anticipation in different countries, and academic partnership grants there. And then the world in the middle there is the meeting today. That's all of these things coming together in one place. And just to briefly introduce the team, so some of you may remember Megan, who has now sadly moved on, well, happily for her, but sadly for us, moved on to a new role based in the Philippines. But we do have the rest of the team who are still the same. So you can see here there's Saheno, who's the FOREWARN coordinator in Madagascar, Anna, who's the FOREWARN coordinator in the Philippines, Ashraf and Marwa, who are both based in Bangladesh, Anila in Pakistan, and then myself, Millie, and David, who are based here in the UK. Just to mention as well, we do have Leah in the Philippines. She's only joined recently, so she's not quite on the slide yet, but she will be added soon. Do keep an eye out for everybody in the chat, and you'll be hearing from, I think, most of this group later on in the meeting. So on that note, we haven't had a meeting in a few months, so there are quite a few updates to come from the different FOREWARNs. So Saheno, over to you to give some updates.
Thank you so much, Millie. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. As Millie said, I'm Sehin, and I'm the FOREWARN coordinator working in Madagascar. And today, I'm very happy to share with you some updates from the 4 countries where FOREWARN is now working. Can you move to the next slide, please, Millie? So we can start from Pakistan. Through the academic consortia, FOREWARN will support in the expanding disaster forecasting and anticipation related to research work, modeling, responses, and updates. Also, 4 heat wave and 1 drought responses in district of Sindh, Punjab, and Balochistan were activated after trigger and basis risk monitoring. Flood, heat wave, and drought models are now in place and actively monitored. FOREWARN is also working on development of urban flash flood forecasting model. Now we can move to the Philippines. A study on rainfall threshold for landslide in the provinces of Albay and Sorsogon was completed. Rainfall thresholds were adopted by the local government of Albay for landslide alert system, and the results was recommended by Sorsogon local government to the provincial council for adoption. The ongoing project is making life-changing opportunities for low-income families exposed to volcanic hazards and the threat of COVID-19. Inclusive early warning kits, COVID-19 PPE and disinfection kits, and multi-use cash transfers were distributed to at-risk communities around Taal volcano. Virtual training conducted to raise awareness on GBV, PCEH, and COVID-19 IPC. Now we are moving to Madagascar. On the cyclone anticipation, we are now working to prepare to launch the cyclone anticipation mechanism for the upcoming season, which is starting from November this year, and on the FPF and FPA on drought also. We are also working to prepare the launch of the drought anticipation process in the southern part of Madagascar. And the last point about the formalization of the group, the FOREWARN group is now underway in Madagascar. The last countries is on Bangladesh. So the 3 expert groups have been shaped into 5 expert groups this year, building expert group pool regularly. In the eve of 2021, 3 EAPs are drafted on landslide, riverbank erosion, and dengue. They are now reviewing them by considering latest monitoring results. We developed a unique triggered monitoring systems with landslide and riverbank erosion. We monitored landslide and riverbank erosion since June 2020 till date. And the last point, joined with Caritas Bangladesh and ACF Consortium to develop the community-led action analysis for landslide and cyclone for coming years. Thank you so much for listening to our country updates. Over to you, Millie.
I think you're muted.
Thanks, David. Thank you. And thanks, Anno. I was just saying we're likely to hear a lot more about the landslide and flash flooding work in our next meeting, as that will be the theme for Q4. Now over to Christine, who I think many of you will be familiar with. She's our Crisis Anticipation and Risk Financing Meal Advisor, and she's been working on an investigation into the Start Fund's experience with flooding alerts, both anticipation and response. And Christine's going to give us some database recommendations around alerting the Start Fund to flooding. As I said, I do encourage questions in the chat, so Christine can respond to those afterwards, or the team can be responding through the presentation. Christine, over to you.
Thanks, Millie. I do worry you've somewhat oversold it there, but thanks. Hi, everyone. So yeah, as usual, as part of the Start Fund's or the Start Network's first contribution to the FOREWARN meetings, we just started with an exploratory data analysis of the flooding data that we have so far, both on the Start Fund anticipation and also the response side. As usual, this comes with the caveat that Start data only provides a rather limited snapshot, but as I've approached the existing data from exploratory approach and tried to see what trends, if any, exist within the Start Fund's experience of flooding, and what information we might be able to move forward to encourage a move towards anticipating flooding crises more effectively. As I'm sure lots of other people would be expectant, when I was preparing for this meeting, I was really certain that there would be non-stop evidence about anticipation of flooding in the Start Funds. I would for sure say that it would be the easiest crisis to forecast. And if we look on the next slide, we can see that in fact it is. It's the most, it accounts for the most alerts raised overall and also the most anticipation alerts also. But for an alert number that accounts for 1/5 of the Start Fund's alerts, the anticipation number is still very small, with only 9 alerts being activated in anticipation of flooding since 2016. So with DRF expanding quickly, and with the Start Funds and Start Network's ongoing focus on anticipating flooding in DRC, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Philippines, to name but a few, can we ask ourselves, why isn't anticipation the default? And actually, shouldn't we be better at it? And what would be the benefits, if any, if anticipation were the default? So on the next slide, I sort of began to initially look and see where the focus for flooding alerts was over the Start Fund. As we can see, since 2015, there have been kind of an evident geographical band of focus, unhelpfully framed around the equator, which I don't think will surprise anyone, with 112 activated alerts across 48 countries. A strong focus on Bangladesh, India, and more recently Nepal, where 100% of the Start Fund Nepal's alerts have been for flooding. However, if we look at the map of anticipation activations, they're much more concentrated, with Sri Lanka actually being the only country with more than one anticipation for flooding crisis, with 4, and a handful of other contexts having only had an activated anticipation alert once. I can see Dilo cheering the Sri Lankan anticipation team in the chat. So is it a case of some contexts are suitable to anticipating flooding, some areas you can anticipate flooding and some you can't? And if that's not the case, then what is actually preventing the majority of fluvial flooding alerts from being anticipated? So very helpfully, the Start Fund does collect responses to your question could this alert have been anticipated? Back one slide, thanks Millie. So even within the same alert, we can see that it's actually difficult to identify consensus as to whether or not an alert for flooding can be anticipated. On the left, we can see the number of agencies who were responsible for implementing or leading an alert, and then the alert number along the bottom. And where they have responded yes to this, to the question, could this alert have been anticipated? It's in orange, and where they said no, it's in green. So we can see that actually, even within the same alert, within the same region or context, some agencies have said, yeah, we could have anticipated this, and some said that we could not. So this does kind of indicate that there might be some incorrect responses within this. Certainly in some cases, agencies might have said they are technically forecastable, but the confidence or the skill of the forecast was considered insufficient to raise. But what this indicates is that there are more flooding alerts that can be anticipatory than we are currently seeing, because we can see across a fifth of the existing response alerts, at least one member of each project implementing team agrees that it could have been anticipated. When an agency reports that a crisis cannot be forecasted, then they may not actually mean this in a technical or a totally literal way. Now, I came at this from a very exploratory data analysis because, to be honest, flooding and the technical side of everything is it's a bit beyond me. But in reviewing the likelihood of flooding crises being raised to the START Fund and also activated as anticipation alerts, I did revert to quite a simplistic grouping of flooding types. So I'm sure if anyone's been on the Zurich Insurance website, they'll be familiar with these images. Yeah, so I approached the flooding disasters as three main types. So fluvial or riverine, pluvial or flash floods, and storm surge or coastal flood. Most approaches, most data that I could see agrees that riverine floods are the most easy to predict, but it doesn't mean that predictions or forecasts are certain or are totally without issue, or that, of course, they will always be accurate. But that where there is contextual knowledge about flooding, as well as agency familiarity of community vulnerability or contextual strain, that these factors can actually be used to strengthen the forecast's impact. And that's something we've also seen with other anticipated crises, where the lack of confidence in a technical forecast can be bolstered by the agency's knowledge and familiarity of contextual vulnerability. When we're using a forecast for humanitarian purposes, it's not about whether the forecast is 100% technically accurate, but whether there are additional aggravating needs that cannot be included or quantified easily. And that's probably the case in many situations. So then, while we know that not all riverine flooding is forecastable, there are a quarter of recent response alerts where at least one agency who implemented a project said that it could have been anticipated. And actually, the START Fund has only responded to flash floods on 3 separate occasions, 2 in Yemen and 1 in Mexico. Unsurprisingly, 100% of the 9 anticipated flooding projects we've had have been for riverine flooding, but many other riverine flooding was instead responded to, with only a very small number of projects exclusively listed as flash floods or storm surge. So perhaps even pushing the flash floods or the storm surge to one side, admitting that it's much more difficult to forecast, is there scope to encourage agencies to try and forecast riverine flooding instead of waiting for it? So even though I approached the information without a hypothesis, when I was reviewing the different documents available, including project proposals, report forms, and learning exchange minutes, there was a difference that really became quite clear, which was that the focus on activity type really differs between the two. So of the 18 funded anticipatory flooding projects across 9 alerts, 78% of projects had a longer term practical mitigating DRR activity as one of their primary activities, which included either the construction of embankments or walls to strengthen riverbanks, the establishment or improvement of an early warning system, and clearing or draining of canals to reduce water levels. Other activities that were common included the softer early action activities of sensitization and health-related activities. And this is in contrast to the 48 flooding response projects that have been funded since 2019. The reason that I'm using The 2019 figure is because this is whenever report forms became digitized on the Start Fund. So this data is much easier for me to access. So apologies that I haven't gone all the way back to 2016 for this data. But infrastructure rehabilitation is mentioned in 38% of project reports as a key result, but focuses more on repairing, rehabilitating, or constructing new sanitation points, water points, or boreholes, and rehabilitating roads after they've been destroyed already. So there are some practical, perhaps DRR activities, but it comes after the point. Key activities instead focused on hygiene promotion, cash or NFIs, seed distribution, and recovery activities such as psychosocial care and health. So while anticipation projects aim to reduce the impact of the flooding by physically mitigating the impact, the response projects don't have the time or capacity to do this, as they instead do what they need to do, which is respond to the immediate needs. And actually, they even act in anticipation of secondary crises, such as waterborne diseases, food insecurity, and personal disruption. Obviously, infrastructure work is not infallible or guaranteed to last forever, but perhaps could reduce impact in the immediate or short term. Other information that became really clear while reviewing the data is that the frequency and severity of flooding crises is increasing from an empirical point of view. In more than 65% of a sample of flooding alert notes, there was a marked increase in the number of or volume of flooding crises as an exacerbating factor. And similarly, in the same sample, contextual humanitarian factors were mentioned as a cause for raising an alert in just under 40%. Alerts for flooding are becoming more frequent. So is it better to act in advance of a flood in order to have capacity and opportunity to complete some longer term activities if relevant? And specifically for members, is there any support that can be provided from Start Fund or FOREWARN in order to anticipate flooding with more confidence? As we saw on slide 5, there seems to be a varying level of confidence among the members, even within the same alert. So whenever we look at the reason why we should be acting in advance, Alert 449 in Sierra Leone included key activities such as channel clearing, bridge construction, and tool supply. And they noted in their PDMs that communities had noted a reduced water level considerably over the flooding season when they had expected the same level of impact as had come in previous years. Recently, Alert 529 in Sudan also noted that while there is no guarantee that the areas will not flood, communities are now much better prepared for the event. Preparedness actions such as cleaning drains has made it less likely that strong rains will lead to devastating flooding. And in the heavy rain immediately after the project, this did not do so. There's an impact study in the works. But while we are kind of missing some more quantitative numerical data to convince people. On the next slide, we can see the number of flooding response report forms where agencies have reported that, on the next slide, sorry, Minnie, where they would, thank you, where they would respond to lessons from the report, which is not focused specifically on would you recommend DRR, would you recommend anticipation? It's just asking for general lessons about the report. And actually, as you can see in just under half of the 48 response projects since 2019, the agencies have recommended that early action, DRR, or anticipation of flooding was the key thing that they would change if they were to do the project again. This is also coming from kind of some of the statements that came out of these recommendations, which is a couple of these are on these slides. Ideally, as we can see in Somalia, Rwanda, DRC, and Mozambique, these are just the alerts from the most recent 100 alerts. And yeah, but we can have this feedback which recommend focusing on early action and which highlight the need to do DRR in advance as an area to improve on in the future. Just a couple of examples. And then if we are assuming that one of the issues is the lack of confidence in the forecasting, or indeed in other crisis types, but for now we're focusing on flooding, then this can be assisted through various means. You obviously have the ad hoc technical support from the team and also from the FOREWARN coordinators who can help assess, triangulate, and verify flooding forecasts. You also have one of the 2 anticipation technical learning grants that START offers, so the analysis for action tool and also the tool grant, which can help develop kind of technical forecast ability in order to help strengthen your ability to act early. And thirdly, we actually have the dynamic risk monitors, which are a resource that are on the START Network website, and it's currently in place for 6 countries with the intention of expansion. These gather data from reputable sites to help you decide when to start thinking about raising an alert. And you can see here a snapshot from the Bangladesh example, which kind of indicates risk warnings, which then it's centralized and in one place for agencies to look into and investigate whether it's appropriate to raise an anticipation alert at this time. Yeah, so basically, really to wrap up, it's just that there is support in order to help overcome the forecasting confidence issues. And really, whenever we look at qualitative and verbatim feedback from all of the, or not all of them, but the majority of flooding alerts that we've had in recent times, it's definitely a point in which we want to encourage members to go. And so, yeah, please do let us know how, if at all, we can help encourage that through technical or other support. But yeah, back to you, Millie.
Great, thank you so much, Christine. It's great to see all of that data kind of represented there for us. We are having a bit of trouble with connection with our next participant, so I'm actually going to reshuffle the agenda a tiny bit, and we're happy to introduce John next from JBA, who's been working with the team in Pakistan on modelling flooding. So Anila, I'd just like to hand over to you to introduce John, please. If I could just quickly mention before I do that though, as we do have interpretation, John, if you could just go maybe 2 notches slower than a normal presentation, just so that we can make sure that everything's being captured by the interpreters. Anila, over to you then, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Millie. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. This is Anila Ajmal, and I'm the FOREWARN coordinator for Pakistan. Before I'd like to give the floor to our next speaker, Mr. John Bevington, I would like to give his brief introduction. He is the Chartered Geographer and Technical Director of Earth Observation and Disaster Management at the JBA Consultant, UK. Mr. John helps to direct JBA's activity in the international development sector and is the project director on the JBA's flood forecasting system. He has extensive 13 years of experience in the insurance and international development sector while developing geospatial analysis tool to help in understanding and communicating risk. So I would like to welcome Mr. John to share your JBA's experience of developing Indus Basin flood model for Pakistan and overall challenges and the learning of the success of the flood forecasting in Pakistan. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Anila, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody. Yeah, we're very pleased to have the opportunity to present the lessons that we have learned in developing a flood anticipation model for the Indus River Basin in Pakistan. This really has been a collaborative effort between ourselves, the START network in the UK, as well as the local technical working group. As Anila mentioned, I'm John Bevington, Technical Director at JBA. And although I'm giving this presentation, I do have to recognise the wider project team, in particular Richard, who's also in this meeting, and Lizzie as well from the START network, both who have also contributed to the preparation of this presentation. So in the presentation itself, to get to lessons learned, I do need to give you a bit of background on how we've got to here, how the model was set up, and how it's going to be used operationally. And then I'll get on to talking about the successes of the project. I'll also then talk importantly about the challenges that we've faced and will face in the future. And then finally, I think I'll leave you with some of the opportunities that have arisen in developing the model for Pakistan. We do have a few animations in the presentation, so I'll be asking Millie to advance the slides by sort of saying click or next or something like that. So bear with us because we've got a couple of animations, and let's hope they work. So just to give you a bit of background to the model, and the model is already operating in Pakistan. There already are flood forecasting models in Pakistan, official models. However, these have been developed perhaps for purposes other than disaster risk financing, for water management, for instance, as well as as well as flood protection. And specifically, considering developing a model for risk financing, these models are not necessarily available or transferable for an insurable disaster risk financing scheme. In these, we may need a more probabilistic analysis based on a stochastic event set that may simulate a plausible events across the basin. So our challenge ultimately was to develop a model for river flooding across the Indus Basin, and I appreciate the distinction made by Christine just in terms of river floods, surface water flooding or pluvial flooding, and coastal flooding. But the model estimates in near real time and in forecast the number of people who will be inundated due to flooding. If you click, please. And if we click again, this will show number of people flooded, but it'll also show the uncertainty in the forecast. So it's not just about giving a stream flow or a water level, it's about understanding where that water would go on the floodplain and understanding the numbers of people affected at district level. Next. We also have to understand the profile of the risk. So we have to understand historically what is the likelihood what's the likely frequency of an event occurring in order to set the triggers for operating a risk financing system. Next. And one more. We've had a very short time frame in developing the model. We have basically 3 months from April to September 2020, and we've been running it we've been running an observational year since September of last year. But certainly we had a very short time frame in which to develop a nationwide model, or certainly a model that covers the majority of population in Pakistan across the Indus Basin. And finally, the results need to be insurable. In other words, a risk financing system may well involve reinsurance, and therefore we have to design the model appropriately to allow future pricing and placement of any insurance or reinsurance. Next slide. So to provide a bit of context, the models are supporting the analysis of risk. So if we click on one hand, and this is very much a static analysis of risk in order to design a risk financing scheme. So this is a one-time analysis of historic risk to understand both the frequency and the severity of flooding in the basin. Click. And then operationally, in a dynamic fashion, we have basically developed an automatic and independent monitoring system to understand when the trigger has been met, when the financing is going to be released to undertake local activities. Next slide. So what we've developed basically is, in effect, 2 models. We use an existing flood model, the JBA Global Flood Model, to develop the risk profiles. This is a flexible catastrophe loss model, very similar to what is used in insurance. In fact, it is used by insurers. And we run it on an open loss modeling framework. But fundamentally, it's allowed us to simulate over 98,000 events across the Indus Basin at a range of severities, at a range of rarities, to understand, well, what would be the frequency and what would be the severity of flooding. And then to monitor the flood events, we use a system called Flood Foresight. And this is an automated system that couples river flow forecasts with pre-computed flood hazard maps that effectively show the depth and extent of water on the floodplain at a range of rarities. So Flood Foresight is not a fully hydrodynamic model. We're not actively modeling where the water is flowing to each time. That is being done by a third-party model. We use that gridded input to select the inundation maps that are appropriate for that rarity of event. So it's an incredibly efficient way of processing all of the probable flow scenarios over the next 10 days to produce a range of impact estimates. And therefore, we're able to express the likelihood of flood impacts to the user. Next slide. So that's okay. I just wanted to express the development stages across the bottom. We had a couple of formatting issues here with the text, so apologies for that. But we had set up, as I mentioned, between April and September last year. We've then been running this observational phase, which is prior to full operation of the financing, in order to refine and understand how the model is going to work and to communicate that with our local actors. Then we anticipate we will have our live operational phase, and there's going to be an ongoing stage of learning and development, allowing us to input better local data to refine the model. Next slide. So both of our models are based on common data sets. These are shown in the middle of this slide. And on one hand, for the risk modeling, the static risk modeling, this is a function, the risk is a function of vulnerability, hazard, and exposure, the combination of those. But it allows us to develop this risk profile on which the anticipatory action can be designed. Click. So this will produce a flood risk profile at a range of depths that shows the number of people affected by flooding according to the frequency, which is shown there on the x-axis. So if we click again. So if we go back one step, please, Millie. On the right-hand side, this is our flood forecasting model through flood foresight technology. This allows us to produce daily footprints of the likelihood of flooding. We use the Global Flood Awareness System, GLOFAS, which provides us with a number of plausible river flow scenarios over the next, well, it goes out about a month, but we use the 10-day forecast for this situation. But by showing those different ensembles, these are an ensemble model is run through a number of plausible rainfall and runoff scenarios. So actually we can present then, by translating those stream flows into inundation maps, we're able to present what the uncertainty in the forecast impact is going to be. The model also accounts for other variables that are important in Pakistan, including snowmelt. But ultimately, that is our trigger on which the START network is able to understand, and the local members are able to understand whether financing can be provided. So if we click through. This slide just shows some of the outputs of our inundation maps, and we have validated these comparing against, most notably, the 2010 flood event. And our extents were comparable with what we could see from official resources and satellite imagery. And we also compared the impacts with official national and international estimates of people affected. And in both cases, for the 2010 event, the model is producing credible estimates for that. We also validated our risk model at district level with the NDMA, the National Disaster Management Authority's multi-hazard vulnerability and risk assessment. And again, we found the outputs of our model to be comparable. So that gives you a sense of what we have produced. What we need to now look at is what lessons have we learned, because this approach could be, the same approach can be provided to other scenarios. So if we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So let's just think about some of the successes. I mean, first of all, it was timely. Setting up the model in such a short period of time really relied on us having models that were flexible enough to be set up and configured for the Indus Basin. It does, however, mean that setting them up using global data does mean that we have to bed these models in over time, and does mean that we have to be able to communicate these with the local actors, both technical and the users as well. The models are flexible. In other words, we were able to produce a number of different risk profiles. We were able to set up a configured email alerting system. So there is a customized email that gives the START network the full range of likely impacts, given the range of that we're seeing in the forecasts. The model is credible in terms of suitability for purpose. We showed through the 2010 event. We are looking to validate based on other events, and as we'll see in the next slide, we are going to be we have been learning by communicating this with the local actors and getting their input on the model. The model also is expansible, so we have been through running it in a pre-operational phase. We've seen that we can change how the model is run. For instance, we have upped our lower level of our lower threshold, because when it's running at too low a threshold, these aren't national flood emergencies, and so we have to configure and calibrate how the model can be run and how the threshold should be used. So we have to understand when a flood is a flood, because ultimately the financing would be, we have to get the model triggering at the level in which financing would be expected. Next slide, please. So this leads us to being very open about the challenges that we've faced. The Indus River Basin is a highly managed river basin. There are a lot of barrages, dams, etc., and there's water that is being used for irrigation and other purposes. And there's a lot of models and control of that system. And what we have set up very quickly is a model that is based on global data. And so we have to now look at that and work out within that framework, how can we customize this more and more to bring in more local data, to engage more with the technical working group, with NDMA, with the Pakistan Meteorological Organization. And that has been difficult. Largely, since the project started, we've been working under COVID conditions. So we haven't been able to meet face-to-face and properly communicate these. Everything has been through Zoom and Teams and other remote methods. So it has been harder to build relationships in that environment and communicate the vision that we have for the model, and how over time more local data can ultimately replace the global data sets that we are using. But we have to be able to access the data, and the data needs to be suitable for the purpose as well. Access to data is always an issue, working internationally in a context. So it's critical that we have objective data for validating the maps and the outputs. We also, in the flood foresight model, we're also using undefended flood hazard maps. So therefore, the model moderates these using flood defense information, and getting access to a sort of national or at least a river basin data sets on flood defense is very tricky. There's not a consistent data set off the shelf that we can just plug in. Over time, if these can be developed, then ultimately they can be integrated into the model. So access to data is always a challenge. And I think also the expectations of the model. We're not trying to replicate what is being done by the Pakistan Meteorological Organizations or the NDMA. We're trying to set up a model that is suitable for risk financing. It is national scale, it is based on global data. The model won't be perfect, but at an aggregate level, in terms of showing the ranges of impacts at district level, then it is, it's an approach that is a starting point that hopefully we can improve over time. And finally, just on the user challenges, we need to understand how the user wishes to use the model on which frequency would the model be expected to pay out ultimately. We need to match up the model as much as we can with local data. It's not always going to be easy, given historically observed data. Getting access to that and bringing that in and using it to calibrate the model will take time, but it's something that we are eager to do, as we show on the next slide, which then it just finally leaves us. Millie, if you could go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Just finally, I wanted to now talk about the opportunities. I've already alluded to the fact that we wish to integrate more local data and more local models into the flood foresight framework in order to ultimately refine the performance of the model and to make sure that it is being used as it has been designed. So we welcome this collaboration with the technical working group and ultimately with the government authorities within Pakistan. But we need to widen this. We need to, by having access to more local data, ultimately, if that can be brought back to ECMWF and the GLOFAST community, then those models can be further calibrated, which would provide wider benefits or benefits to a wider community interested in setting up anticipatory or real-time risk financing systems or anticipatory action systems. There are plenty of opportunities for local engagement. We have had the two-way exchange through the technical working group.
We are running out of time, so please. Yeah.
I'm just concluding now. Thank you. On one hand, they have the local knowledge of the basin and the models and the context. And on the other hand, we have other expertise that we can bring to bear around probabilistic modeling, ensemble forecasting, etc. So we have to embrace complaints, as someone said on a call recently. And finally, the model is flexible enough to be used for exercises and simulations, where we can ultimately test how the model should work using probable or plausible scenarios and refine then the contingency plans, etc., that would be based around the model. So this type of approach is getting wider interest in the disaster risk financing community. We are adopting a similar approach in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but we'd be very interested in hearing how this approach could be used elsewhere. Next slide. Just finally, we do need to acknowledge and thank the technical working group in Pakistan and the members that have engaged with the project. The support has been incredibly useful, and we look forward to continuing working with you. Thanks very much, everybody, for listening. Happy to answer questions, and Richard, I just see, is also answering questions as we go along. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, John, for that honest presentation. It's great to hear all about the progress that's been made with that process. There's lots of enthusiasm for the model in the chat and suggestions of where it might work elsewhere. And also thanks for your speaking speed. I think that's been followed very well in French for the French members of the audience. So thank you very much for that presentation. If I could encourage, as Ashraf has mentioned in the chat, if we could just pop questions in there for now, just as we are, as I say, quite pressed for time, and then hopefully at the end we might have time to come back to some of those, or otherwise we can kind of condense them and send them through to you afterwards. Unfortunately, we are still having a bit of trouble getting hold of our speaker from the DRC, who was going to speak to their kind of plans, as you mentioned, John, around this model. So we will now move on to the wider sector, so moving away from the START network experiences of anticipating flooding. And I'd like to invite Winner from the Zambia Red Cross Society to talk about the experience of test activation of a forecast-based financing system. And we'll then move on to Annalena from Mozambique, who has been talking about the EAP that have been developed there and a simulation in the Limpopo Basin. Winner, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Okay, so I'm going to share about the test activation experience in Zambia. I don't know if you're able to hear me.
Yes, loud and clear. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. So next slide, please. Okay, so in my short presentation, I'm going to briefly talk about the introduction, the trigger monitoring system that we have, the test activation that we conducted, the challenges, and also a few lessons that we managed to generate from the test activation that we conducted this year. So next slide. So Zambia Red Cross Society is implementing a flood focused based financing, of which the EAP was approved in 2020 towards the end of the year. So the FBF for flood that we have is basically focused on three prioritized hazards or risks, which is the displacement of people due to destruction of shelter, waterborne diseases, waterborne disease outbreak such as diarrhea due to contamination of water points, and also loss of crops due to waterlogging. So those basically are the three prioritized risks that we thought of addressing in the flood EAP that we have. Next slide. So after the EAP was approved, the National Society started conducting some readiness activities, and we managed to conduct readiness activities in a total of 17 districts. And then we managed also to procure some non-food items in readiness for response. Then after that, we just started monitoring the system that we have. Next slide. So the system that we have is like we have heard from the previous speaker, also we are using GLOFAS. So we have managed to connect GLOFAS to a system which we developed with the Data 510, which is called FBF system or impact-based forecasting. So under that, the triggers that we managed to peg as a national society, we looked at the 10 years return flood. Then we looked at 1,000 households, as we are looking at extreme events, not any other flooding, but extreme, and we looked at 1,000 households as our target, and then also reaching 100% threshold in the GLOFAS with a lead time of 7 days to ensure that we are able to conduct some early actions. Next slide. So with those triggers that we managed to peg as a national society, we continued monitoring for floods in the FBF system and also GLOFAS. So we managed to activate or to conduct a test activation in 2 districts, namely Namwala and Itezitezi. So under those districts, in our system, it indicated that about 1,900 households were going to be affected, and also it was indicating to us that it was going to be a 20 years return flood instead of even the 10 years that we set in the system, and also it indicated that the flood, we're going to have 100% probability of experiencing that flood that we were anticipating in the lead time of 7 days. So that's how we managed to activate the FBF system. Instead of having a full activation, we decided to go for a test activation, so that we just test how effective the system is before we could have it we could activate it like on a full scale. Next slide. So on the slide, which sorry, the previous slide. So on this slide, what you're able to see there is how it comes in the FBF system. and also on Glofus on your right. So in the system, it is able to indicate that 100% the probability of that flood is likely to happen. And the one which is showing in purple, it is a 50 year and a 20 years and above return period. The one which is in red, it is a 10 years year return flood. And then on your left, this is the FBF system, which we developed in partnership with 510, which is able to indicate exactly where the flood is likely to happen, the total number of people that are likely to be exposed, and we are able to change layers so that we can switch, for example, to roads, to croplands, to grasslands, and everything to just show what kind of variables are likely to be affected if that flood is to happen. Okay, next slide. So when we did the test activation, all the early actions that we implemented, they were to address those priorities that those priority risks that we identified earlier for waterborne, for disease outbreak, destruction of shelter and displacement of people, as well as the crop loss. So we managed to implement the early actions that we selected to implement. For example, dissemination of early warning messages, distribution of empty bags to ensure that people are able to harvest their crops and be able to store, preserve properly, as well as the distribution of chlorine and the trampolines to ensure that those that are likely to be displaced are able to have access to shelter. So we managed to do that, and our strategy, we were working with the various structures at the national, district, and community level. At the national level, we were working with the, okay, noted. Okay, next slide.
Uina, could you wrap it up by next 30 seconds?
Okay, so thank you so much. So the challenges that we experienced included the following. We had a bit of postponement in the implementation of the early actions because we had to get clearance from the government and other relevant key stakeholders to ensure that we conduct some readiness activities or early actions before a disaster could actually occur. And also in some selected communities, we didn't have volunteers, which made our life a little bit difficult to ensure that we identify people that were supposed to, beneficiaries that were supposed to receive assistance, and also access challenges because it was almost, it started getting flooding in some communities. Then on the lessons that we managed to draw, we saw that alerts can be received anytime. It can be over a public holiday, over the weekend where people are not in the offices, and the 7 days it starts to count. And also there are other funding opportunities that we can access as compared to just activating the EAP with funding from IFRC. In our case, I think we managed to receive funding from through bilateral support from our PNS, which we have in country, which is the Netherlands Red Cross. Also, once the EAP is approved, there are some readiness activities that are supposed to be conducted, and it is not always that the system will activate or the triggers will be reached in the districts where readiness activities have been conducted and the prepositioning of non-food items are to be prepositioned. So anything can happen elsewhere outside those districts. Then another thing which we noted was collaboration. So we worked effectively with the stakeholders at all levels, and that made us manage to achieve what we managed to achieve when we did the test activation. The last one is a need for a prior government approval. So we had a good number of things that needed the approval from the government before we could move in. And we thought it is very much important to have those already approved by the government. for example, the warning messages, the clearance to ensure that the early actions are conducted, and so on and so forth, as compared to waiting till the government gives us a go-ahead. Otherwise, that is the end of the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Wena, and sorry to rush you at the end there. Ashraf's doing a great job of timekeeping. But thank you for that excellent presentation, and it's really interesting to hear that you use the GLOFAST data. I think we'll hear a bit more on that later in the day. Just passing over now to Annalena from the German Red Cross. Annalena, I think if you could go slowly for the interpreters, but quickly for the time. Sorry to give you that impossible suggestion there, but over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lily. Yeah, I'll try. So from Zambia, I'll take you to Mozambique and give you an insight of how we set up FBF for river and flooding. And I think it will be an interesting example of how differently FBF trigger methodologies and so forth can roll out in neighboring countries. So next slide, please. So here, a brief overview of the flood EAP of the Mozambique Red Cross, which was supported in its development by the German Red Cross and also has the FBA by DREF funding mechanism of the IFRC, our anticipatory funding instrument of the Red Cross movement. And our early actions look into the prevention or mitigation of the spread of waterborne diseases by through the distribution of wash kits at evacuation centers prior to the impact of flooding, distribution of mosquito nets to prevent the spread of malaria post-impact, as well as the support to government authorities, the Disaster Management Authority, in the evacuation of at-risk households and at-risk communities. We also disseminate early warning messages prior to the flooding to at-risk districts, and yeah, do all that in close cooperation, such as Zambia Red Cross, with the government authorities. Our trigger is a bit simpler. We base on nationally issued hydrological bulletins of the National Hydrological Services, DNJ-RH. And we trigger when the water levels at the upstream river reference station reach a 5-year return period water level. And we address the 4 main river basins of Mozambique: Limpopo, Mbuzi, Likongo, and Zambezi river basins. We have a lead time of 72 hours, so a bit more time pressure than the EAP in Zambia, working with a 7-day lead time. So we, in principle, have 3 days for action. Next slide. So I'll be sharing some experiences from the past rainy cyclone season, 2020-21, in which we also did a test activation, just as our colleagues in Zambia. And what we do throughout a season is we monitor the forecast outlets of the DNJ-RH, National Hydrological Services, and their flood bulletins that they issue. And we monitor for our 4 triggers for the different river basins in Mozambique. The trigger level I've explained already. In addition, we also monitor other outputs such as GLOFAST, flood emergency reports, but we have decided to build our triggers on the forecasts that are issued by the competent national authorities such as DNJ-RH, hence the water level linked triggers in the river basins. Next slide, please. So once we have an indication that a trigger will be reached, we make decisions on where to target the intervention of the anticipatory actions based on a composite vulnerability index. Mozambique Red Cross has developed together with Climate Center, the German Red Cross and IFRC, which is mainly a composite index of different vulnerability criteria, which gives us an overview where we see the highest levels of vulnerability in at-risk districts. We overlay that with flood extent maps. In the last rainy cyclone season, we were getting support from GLOFAS also, and the flood emergency bulletins with flood extent maps, which indicated also critical infrastructure likely to be impacted, and that in overlay with our vulnerability information and indicators, we selected the district for the test activation, which ended up being Shockwave in Gaza province, Mozambique, at the riverbanks of the Limpopo River. Next slide, please. And here's some impressions. So we strongly build, also just as Zambia Red Cross, on our volunteer network for the distribution of early warning messages. We distribute the wash kits, mosquito nets. In the last season, we combined or added an extra early action with COVID-19 protection kits, given the ongoing pandemic. And we support the national authorities in the evacuation of at-risk households. Next slide, please. And now just a brief overview of how we're using the seasonal climate outlook. So the seasonal forecast to inform some readiness activities. The seasonal regional outlook forum for Southern Africa took place in August. It was downscaled at the national level in Mozambique in September. So we have an indication of where we are expecting above normal rainfall and hence higher likelihood of flooding. And this is guiding our decision-making of the location of the pre-positioning of stock. Where we focus institutional readiness activities, training of branch staff and volunteers, as well as maintenance of data preparedness, and updating of the contingency plan. Next slide. So as a brief summary, in principle, the seasonal outlook is telling us that we are expecting above normal to above normal rainfall in center south of Mozambique, meaning for us that we are monitoring with a bit more focus the river basins Vuzi and Limpopo in center and southern Mozambique, and we're getting ready as institution, as Red Cross movement with the partners for possible activation, full activation this time in those two river basins. Next slide.
Sorry,
and that just as a
sorry, just
time's
a
up.
question. Yeah, if you could move towards wrapping up, that would be great. Thank you very much.
All right. Yeah, maybe skip that slide then. Okay, so in principle, I mean, what we and I think we all of us actors working anticipatory action on flooding and, as a matter of fact, on the variety of natural hazards. It's various levels of information and readiness work we need to target. Moving into a season, we're in October, so the rainy season is starting in Mozambique. So also having a clear overview and inventory of available capacities at the national level of the National Society, the Mozambique Red Cross, is of great importance, ensuring that we're ready for action in terms of available equipment, the pre-positioned stock, but also the trained actors who are part of the actions. Next slide. And the last slide, I promise. So just as an example of concrete readiness activities, we will be doing an integrated simulation exercise, large scale and real time. So really playing out the full activation with deployment of the teams to the river basin in which we activate, and integrating that also with the first response phase, immediate response, to also test that in the beginning, very start of the season, rainy season. So that is happening later on in October. I think I will wrap up with that. I hope it was a brief insight into what's happening in terms of flood anticipatory action in Mozambique. And I'm handing over to you, Millie.
Thank you so much, and sorry to rush you at the end there. It was great to hear all of that information, and I do encourage any questions in the chat, please, to continue that conversation. Just to go back slightly now to our speakers from the DRC, I believe Gang is here and able to speak to you. As a reminder, for those of you who are listening in English, please do switch to the English channel via the globe in the bottom right-hand side of your screen to hear the translation into English, as this presentation, I think, will be in French. So Gang is a member of the Hub leadership team in DRC, who are an amazing group who work on a voluntary basis on setting up the Hub there. And Gang is going to talk about the DRC Hub's experience of flooding in the DRC and the Hub's plans for developing a disaster risk financing system. Gang, if you're there, over to you.
Thanks, Millie. Can I count on you for the slides, please?
Sorry?
Millie? Can I? Yes. Yes. Go ahead. Next slide, please. Thank you for this opportunity. I would like to quickly say something about the floods in DRC. You have the map of DRC here, where we are trying to give the location for those who are not really familiar with Africa. You can see in the middle and pink color, the DRC there. And we are trying to give some patterns of what happens.
Gang, I'm very sorry to
as far as floods are concerned. And here it said, when we have rains in the north, there are no rains in the south. And the level of the Congo River is almost constant. And they say that the biggest cities that are alongside the Congo River is Kindu, Kisangani, Bandaka, and Kinshasa. Next slide, please.
Hello. Hello.
Hi, Yves.
Hi. Yes, it seems like Gang has a connectivity problem. So he was just presenting the map of DRC, which has 25 provinces. And among the 25 provinces, all these are where we are experiencing flooding in DRC, including Kinshasa, Mbandaka, Bumba, Isangi, Kisangani, Kindu, Bukama. You can find them on this area, especially in the west, near the Congo, where the Congo go through. So next slide, please. This is the Congo basin, which is the second in the world after the Amazoni basin. So it's take this Congo Brazzaville and the République Centrafricaine, Angola, Tanzania, and Zambia. So which is take all the water from the Congo flood. Okay, next. So this is just a background, an overview flooding in DRC, it's not a new phenomenon. It has taken a decade to it's happened in many years. So the affected locations are both cities and the villages. And we have also, it's also caused by the climate change as well, when we are experiencing many rain, and also the many Congo flood is also having la crue de la fleuve, which make the phenomenon to appear both in rural and urban area. Next. Next, please. So all these are different time where we have experienced flooding in this area. So it's a phenomenon that actually this period is coming around October to April in those different locations. Next. I've seen in the chat that I can also go make
we
it.
have,
okay.
We have some interpreters, so feel free if you would prefer to speak in French.
Ok. Maintenant, en termes de réponse, il y a certaines actions qui sont faites par la communauté, et notamment qui mettent des sacs de sable, qui font des villages des caniveaux, qui font des murs de protection des maisons, qui font des déménagements. Ça, c'est en termes, on dirait beaucoup plus en termes d'anticipation. Et puis, ce sont des organisations qui sont faites par les communautés elles-mêmes. Il n'y a pas beaucoup de projets ou d'activités faites par les humanitaires qui concernent l'anticipation, la prévention. Next. En termes de réponses, justement, on a parlé de déménagement, on quitte momentanément les lieux et puis on retourne quand la situation s'améliore. Et puis on reconstruit les maisons. En termes d'impact, quand on a vu l'impact des inondations sur les habitations, notre plan de secours aux urgences classifie les inondations comme un deuxième aléa qui a plus d'impact sur les habitations après les éruptions volcaniques. Next. Maintenant, avec les projets ou les programmes d'IRF, nous avons été déjà en mesure d'organiser des ateliers de qualification et classification des risques où on a priorisé des aléas, notamment l'aléa inondation et l'aléa éruption volcanique, des aléas qui sont modélisables. Et nous sommes en train de travailler avec la JBA qui est en train de vouloir modéliser les inondations en RDC. Et parmi les milliers qu'on a montré là-bas, les provinces qui sont touchées, il y a 2 provinces qui vont permettre de valider les modèles, notamment la province de Maniema et la province d'Itsangui. Et toutes ces 2 provinces se trouvent le long du fleuve Congo, où le fleuve même passe au milieu de la province. Et aussi, nous sommes en train de vouloir élaborer la stratégie de financement des risques qui cible principalement les 2 aléas qu'on a priorisés. Mais dans ce processus d'élaboration de la stratégie, nous nous rendons compte qu'il y a aussi d'autres acteurs qui travaillent sur la préparation aux désastres, notamment CAFOD, Caritas Belgique, avec ses partenaires locaux, avec le financement de ECO, et qui cible l'une des provinces pour lesquelles on est en train de modéliser. Et l'apport des stats ici sera qu'avec la modélisation des GDA qui est beaucoup plus scientifique, peut-être ça pourra aider l'approche communautaire, parce que les systèmes d'alerte précoce aux inondations qu'on va mettre en place, ça sera beaucoup plus communautaire. Alors, les données scientifiques pourraient aider aux communautés d'avoir des périodes de prédiction de l'événement qui vont arriver. Alors, nous allons aussi faire des évaluations participatives de vulnérabilité dans les zones affectées par les inondations pour permettre à ce que les communautés puissent mettre en place des plans communautaires de préparation et réponse aux urgences, ainsi que des systèmes d'alerte précoce. Là, il y a aussi un financement de l'Agence française de développement qui appuie ces processus et qui vont nous permettre de répondre et même d'anticiper en cas de désastre. En bref, c'est ce qu'on est en train de faire en RDC dans le cadre du Hub RDC en ce qui concerne les inondations. Merci.
Je veux
Okay, thank you, Billy.
Thank you, Yves. Gang, did you want to come in there?
Yes, I just wanted to really commend the commitment from the Start Network team in the UK. They've been really instrumental in helping us in connections with GBA, with Seheno in Madagascar, and the help also of Amadou. I think it's really, really important to mention that. And it's also to say that we will be bearing with us because these last days, and actually very often we have connectivity problems, and that's the reason why we are not really that prompt or that on time for some of the requirements. And thank you for being there as a backup. That's what I just wanted to add. Thank you.
Maybe what we could request is a sharing experience. I've seen Mozambique, the experience of Mozambique, how they both combine the scientist expertise and the local community knowledge, so that they work together.
Thank you both. Thank you both for that presentation. I think we will need to move to the next one just in the interest of time. But thank you once again for presenting that. And yeah, we do appreciate the connection difficulties that you sometimes have. Apologies as well if that translation wasn't quite working for some people. We will keep working on that, and hopefully by next time we'll have it completely resolved. So moving on now, I think we have Dr. Liz Stevens up next, who will be talking to us about global flood forecasting systems and how they can be used for anticipatory action. I think some of you may be familiar with Dr. Stevens. She's leading on the Fathom programme, yeah, and is obviously with the Department of Meteorology in the University of Reading and with the Red Cross and Red Crescent Climate Centre. Liz, over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Millie. Yes, so I know many people on the call. It's nice to meet you all if I haven't met you already. Just to say today that I am presenting in my role as University of Reading, but hopefully you'll see that there's quite a lot of overlap. So I'm presenting work that's been funded as part of the Fathom project, which is funded in turn by SHEAR, Science for Humanitarian Emergencies and Resilience, which is a research programme funded by FCDO in the UK and NERC, which is part of the Research Council. So yeah, I'm talking about how global flood forecasting systems can be used for anticipatory action. And of course, we've seen already within the presentations from Pakistan and Zambia that it's already being used for anticipatory action in many countries around the world. So on to the next slide. So why am I talking about global forecasts? What are global forecasts compared to local flood forecasting systems? So when we're talking about global forecasting systems and global flood forecasting systems, we're talking about forecasts that are produced by global computational centers. And this is because they have advanced and very expensive supercomputers. So they have a lot of computational power. And this means that they can run the models many times as part of ensemble approaches and also out to longer lead times as well. Yeah, out to perhaps 40 days or even some seasonal forecasting systems as well, but we have to consider what the skill is. These global computational centers also have the computer power to be able to run the forecasts back over time as well. So these so-called reforecast data sets, and that gives us an opportunity to evaluate the current model version and the skill of that model. And so lots of forecasting centers without those kind of resources are not able to do that. However, when it comes to national forecasting agencies or local forecasts for a specific river basin, those forecasts have a much better understanding of the local context. So they'll know if there's some specific water management features like dams or reservoirs and how they're operating. They might know about the flood defenses and the condition of flood defenses. And they also have the mandates to issue forecasts and early warnings, and they can link with other national and local government agencies to coordinate disaster response. So somehow we have to provide that link between these global forecasts that can provide all of that sort of advanced information in terms of skill and longer lead times with that local knowledge and that local understanding and local mandate. So on to the next slide. So what I'm going to present here today, that I think there are the three different ways that global flood forecasting systems are useful, but there are pros and cons for using these systems for anticipatory action, and that the development of global systems needs to change to recognize these pros and cons. On to the next slide. So the first way I think that global models can be used are as interim solutions where there isn't currently a system that's operational within a national forecasting agency, but there's perhaps one under development. And so GLOFAST can be used in the meantime before that national capacity has been developed. So, for example, there's a case study for Uganda where we at the University of Reading have collaborated with the Uganda Red Cross Society, the Ugandan Ministry of Water and Environment, the National Meteorological Authority, and 510 as well, to develop the use of global flood awareness system in Uganda, where there is limited existing capacity for hydrological forecasting, but they have obviously a lot of hydrological observations that can be used to really test whether GLOFASS is skillful. So GLOFASS was used way back in 2015 as part of an initial pilot project, and now we've scaled this up across the whole country, and we've worked with the Ugandan team to carry out an evaluation of GLOFASS by looking at the reforecasts and interrogating that with gauge data from the Ministry of Water and Environment. So there's an interim solution there for you. On to the next slide. We also use the Global Flood Awareness System for longer lead times. So the case study here is the Brahmaputra in Bangladesh, and we collaborate with the Bangladesh Flood Forecasting and Warning Centre. We have a PhD student, again funded by SHEAR, who works at the University of Reading now, but he's on a kind of placement from the Flood Forecasting and Warning Centre. And we're looking at developing the extended range forecasting capacity on the Brahmaputra River. And what that has ended up in so far is that we use GLOFASS as a pre-activation at longer lead times where there isn't an FFWC forecast available, and then the FFWC forecast is used at shorter lead times. So we're ending up with this sort of seamless forecasts for seamless decision making. So in 2020, that work was actually implemented. So it triggered the release of $5.2 million worth of SURF funds and funds as well by IFRC's FBA by the DREF to take action before the floods in Bangladesh. And I think there's another presentation on that later, so I won't go into too much detail about the benefits of that intervention. On to the next slide. SASAD is also then doing some more in-depth work to provide a decision-led evaluation of the GLOFASS model and also the new version of the GLOFASS model. So we're looking at the criteria required for every single decision that would be taken before a flood. So not just the humanitarian decisions, but also the decisions that are made by individuals within the community. So evacuation of livestock, for example, or decisions that are made by the local disaster authority. So evacuation of people to the flood shelters. Along with decisions that are made at longer lead times, such as the aid distribution by humanitarian agencies and the communication, sort of agricultural planning decisions and so on. So you'll see on the right an indication of this GLOFASS evaluation, and we've been developing a tool to do this decision-led evaluation, which anyone would be able to pick up and use, provided that they had some gauge data in a country, and looking at the false alarm ratio and the probability of detection at different lead times based on those decisions that are being made. So here we're doing a comparison between the old version of the GLOFASS model and the new version, and just checking which model is better and whether it's still good enough for each of those decisions that we're making. On to the next slide. So we've also been using the Global Flood Awareness System for major disasters, and we've been funded by FCDO to produce flood forecast bulletins, and actually Lena was presenting some of the output from that for the presentation for Mozambique. So we've been linking with an inundation modelling and mapping from the University of Bristol and Fathom, which is a company that's emerged out of Bristol as well, with the surge forecast provided by HR Wallingford. And it's a relatively similar approach to that presented by JBA earlier, except we do it on demand, and we also provide that sort of expert and interpretation of the uncertainty as well. So this so far has been used to support humanitarian operations for tropical cyclones Idai and Kenneth in 2019, Iota in Central America in 2020, and Eloise, as Lena presented, in 2021. And FCDO have just brought us in to provide more bulletins for any forthcoming tropical cyclones and to initiate some kind of development activities to improve those bulletins further. So you might well see that information. We also not just do that in an anticipatory way, but provide further support after the disaster to give indication of the impacted communities as well. And we produce those forecasts of exposure. Next slide. So this just gives an indication of the sort of information that we might produce before a disaster. So this is what the bulletin will look like with a situational summary. It's a sort of 2-page bulletin we aim for, but sometimes with a lot more maps if we've been requested to provide more detailed information, and a bit of timeline where we give an indication of the flood impact. So in this example, there was going to be flooding relatively soon after landfall in the Beira region around Buzi. But then a couple of weeks later, all of that rainfall would make its way down the Limpopo River, and we would expect flooding around Chokwe, as Lena presented earlier. So moving on to the next slide, I just wanted to think a little bit about whether global forecasts are compatible with the original rationales for anticipatory action. So we've been thinking and interviewing a number of different people, and one of the things that has arisen about from that is this sort of mention in the Sendai framework to think about community-based early warning systems, and the use of GLOFASS doesn't really marry with that very well, because of course it's not developing any local capacity. So what does GLOFASS provide? Well, it provides a consistent source of information, and it provides longer lead times and ensemble forecasts and reforecast data sets that can give us confidence in the use. But on their own, they're not building national capacity, and we need to be very careful that model updates are improving decision-making. And so it's really difficult each time to really evaluate that they're providing information for the local context. And we also need to do much more work to make sure that the release time of the forecast and the updates are useful for all kinds of time zones. So GLOFASS isn't actually released at a very useful time for the Philippines. And there's currently very limited scope for the national hydromet services to feed back and inform developments. So on to the final slide. So I think we really need to think about how the development and use of global forecasts should be undertaken going forward. So we need to consider how national capacity could be supported with these internationally developed forecasting systems. So I've presented here today these 3 ways of using the GLOFASS as a sort of interim solution, as longer lead times, and as support for major disasters. But all of that needs to be done in some way through hopefully a formalized engagement with the national hydromet services. And we need to make sure as well that we can provide some kind of seamless integration of those global forecasts, which are perhaps at those longer lead times with the probabilistic ensemble information, and integrate that with those local short time forecasts as well, so that you really can't see a difference in that information source, and you have a consistency of message at that local scale as well. So yeah, that's a very, very swift update on what we've been doing within SHEAR, and there's far more I could have been presenting today as well. A lot of our work gets written up as blog posts on the Anticipation Hub, so please do take a look at that, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Liz, and sorry to cut you short there, but I'm sure that will be super useful for those who already have models and those thinking of starting to develop their own models. Just to say that we will share the slides around afterwards and all of the recordings, of course, so yeah, people can catch up if they need to. Ashraf, over to you now, I think, to introduce the next couple of speakers.
Yeah, welcome you all to our Bangladesh panelists. Here with us is Imtiaz Ahmed, who is right now the monitoring and evaluation specialist. And we do have Sumaya Kabir from Shufal Consortium. So she's leading that consortium from CARE Bangladesh. So you might know, like, Bangladesh is doing forecast-based financing or anticipatory action for the last 3 years. So they are gonna present what we've been learning so far and what are the challenges and experiences together. So I'm welcoming Imtiaz Bhai. So if you could just start with that, and then Sumaya afterwards. Thank you. Over to you, Imtiaz Bhai.
Thank you, Bhai. So again, good to see so many known faces and also learn from anticipatory work across the world. So just to add, to start from where Liz ended, is that Bangladesh also has a unique opportunity since it has got a forecast-based financing mechanism ingrained in its government policies. So that gives us kind of an edge over other processes. So now, can you please go to the next slide, please? So we actually followed OCHA's two-trigger mechanism, which we just discussed, one of which includes GLOFAS. Another one is that based on our National Flood Forecasting Warning Center. So based on that framework, we assisted 18,000 households in 2020 in the flood affected areas of Jamuna Basin. And our intervention had two kinds of assistance items. One was sealable drums and animal feed. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yes, as you can see, the trigger, you can see the two triggers. The first one was activated on 4 July, and the second one was around 11 July. But the localized flood peaks, we tried to target the localized flood peaks. And the time was very crucial because it was Idul Adha, because at that time, the largest amount of cattle sales takes place in the country, as well as the almond planting season. Can you go to the next slide, please? So we also followed up the impacts through a quantitative assessment. So we found mixed results, actually. This was because I will cover these issues more in details at the end. But mostly we found that this was useful to some extent in saving food and seeds specifically for the next planting season, and also significantly reduce animal mortality. And also, one of the things was that specifically for livestock rearers, those who received feeds were actually able to sell their livestock for Eid at a better price, way better price. And also we found, can you go to the next slide, please? And also we found that a lot of respondents mentioned that their usual commodity and input markets were not functioning. So this thing was crucial because cash-based assistance only wouldn't have helped them like cover these aspects. Also, we found a slightly higher food consumption status or food security status among our beneficiaries, and lower loan sizes and better ability to pay back, and less spending on food and buying animals. Can you please go to the next slide, please? So we have tried to very briefly summarize our lessons. So one of the things was that, to be very honest, we were a bit underprepared because we weren't expecting the flooding, because in 2020 the floods were earlier. Although we have a 5-year return period based trigger mechanism, this was so far one of the highest flood levels in the last 30 or 35 years. So we didn't have enough time. We have just worked through the framework and triggering process, and then suddenly there was this flood and we didn't have enough time to procure and get things ready on the ground. So this was kind of learning for us, especially for FAO. The work that FAO did across many countries was mostly focused on slow onset disaster. So this was kind of something very abrupt. So what we felt that this needs to be it needs to have flexible financing and pre-positioning of goods. Also, there are some mismatches in the GLOFAS and FFWC based triggering mechanism. So these things can be further fine-tuned. And another lesson was that we found that although we worked through government partners like Department of Agricultural Extension and Department of Livestock Services, for our work, we found that although they were very supportive, they were not quite well aware. So their sensitization was necessary. And we started working on this from this year. We are doing this a lot. In addition, we felt that there should be further coordination among implementing agencies. So for this, from this year, we have started a common beneficiary profiling. So all the agencies who are working under the SURF AA framework, we initiated a joint beneficiary profiling, and based on certain characteristics, each agency will support certain households, something like that. And also somehow connect this to our national social protection system. So yeah, I think that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Sumaya.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. So my name is Sumaya. I'm the consortium coordinator for the Shufal project in Bangladesh. And this is a project which has been running for 2 years now already. And we've just kicked off our work for the second phase, which should go on for another 18 months. We're funded by the European Commission or the European Union Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid, ECHO, led by CARE, also including Concern Worldwide Islamic Relief and RIMES, and newly Oxford Policy Management. So we largely look at how we can strengthen the local systems, the local government systems, local institutions to implement forecast-based action. If you can go on to the next slide, please. So we as well, we focus on the northern region of Bangladesh. These are particularly the districts that are flooded first when there is flooding in the Jamuna-Brahmaputra basin. And these also happen to be one of the poorest districts in the country. And a lot of riverine islands or jars, which we call it, along the riverside. And they're largely agri-based communities, largely poor communities as well, and almost cut off from a lot of the local administrations because they're, living far away in the islands along the rivers. So next slide, please. Right, so because we wanted to work primarily with the local government systems and of course strengthen the national government, their governance systems, we looked at what sorts of triggers the communities or what sort of triggers the local institutions would need. The triggers which are largely set for extreme level of floods do not give communities enough time to take early actions, because by then the waters are already there. It's quite difficult, communication is quite challenging. So there's a lot of factors which made sense for us to look at lower levels of floods or set triggers at a lower level. Again, looking at saving lives and assets, looking at community-based actions. So these are actions which can try to cater to larger numbers of people. And most importantly, we use the local forecasting system. So this is the flood forecasting warning system, which the presenters before me talked about. Largely, the trigger looked at if we are expecting above normal flooding and looking at floods which last longer than 5 consecutive days. So these are basically that arise in conditions which are really difficult for communities to act or to save any assets. So we focus mainly on that trigger, and of course looking at 15-day lead times, which will allow us to take some preparatory actions in getting, for example, the plans ready, or understanding which roads to focus on or which communities to focus on. And then the actual actions are triggered when a 75% probability is reached. So this is largely around the 10-day lead time or 10-day probabilistic forecast or a 5-day deterministic forecast. So let me give you an idea of what early actions we're talking about. If you move on to the next slide, please. So community-based early actions, it's largely evacuation support. It's quite difficult to have boats available, and it costs a lot for households to move to safer ground, higher ground. So ensuring that there is evacuation support available, in ensuring that the flood shelters or the evacuation points are prepared to receive households, to have temporary shelter materials because there's not sufficient number of flood shelters in these locations, and also to ensure that the wash support is also there. We also looked at repairs to key embankments and roads, especially for maintaining communication, as well as to ensure that water does not seep into villages more in the inland, and cash packages for the most vulnerable households. We found that these are kind of like the larger actions which are needed, especially which are implemented by the disaster management committees in this period of time, which will be really useful in reducing the impacts faced by a community. I'll tell you a little other thing. We went through a very participatory process to develop these early actions. I saw your hand. So we went through a massively participatory process, talking to communities, talking to institutions, ahead of developing these plans, as well as afterwards when we were evaluating. So if you move on to the next 2 slides, just quickly through. Yeah, so early warning is very important. We found that just by receiving the information, communities were able to take a lot of actions by themselves. And then further, most vulnerable households needed the additional support which we gave. So we saw remarkable results in areas which we were focusing on versus areas where we were not present. If you go on to my last slide. So there's quite a lot of actors already on ground. You've heard from UN SURF, they're supporting the UN agencies to deliver early actions. There's the Red Cross. So what we found is that largely we needed harmonized standard operating procedures, early action protocols at the national level, which takes into account the community-based early actions, as well as higher levels of floods, which we obviously experienced last year, where the international financing really comes into support. There are need for identified dedicated funds, and this is, again, lessons directed to how we can support the government. Also focusing on longer lead time, particularly, and key sectors, which are generally neglected. So WASH especially was very important for us. All in all, we really need more evidence and collectively working together. So I end here. My slides will be available. So feel free to reach out to me if you need more information. Thanks.
Hi, MTS, thank you so much for sticking with the time limit there. I know it's very tight and really appreciate that. And thank you also for your brilliant presentations. I know a couple of people have had to drop off the line. We do still have around 80 people online though, and we have one last presentation. Anna, I'll just hand over to you to introduce our final speaker.
All right. Thank you very much, Millie. And hi, good evening and good noon to all of you who are in other locations. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Ms. Rhoda Avila. She's the Humanitarian Portfolio Manager at Oxfam Philippines. She's also a campaigner for more than 20 years, mostly on development and humanitarian policy and advocacy work in the Philippines. And her extensive work in disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, savings and financial inclusion, and livelihoods access to poor and vulnerable communities will also show show us why she is the one leading this project in the Philippines. So over to you, Rhoda, and thank you very much. Please, please stay on for this sharing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna. Good day to everyone. My sincerest gratitude to Start Network for this opportunity to share one of our ongoing anticipatory action project for flood-prone communities in the southern part of the Philippines in Mindanao. Next slide, please. In 2019, the Philippines ranked 9th of the riskiest country worldwide. It remains to be highly vulnerable to extreme weather events and other sudden onset disasters, especially the regions along the typhoon belt and those in communities suffering from repeated displacement due to armed conflict with high poverty index. While the Philippines made significant progress on improving disaster preparedness, improvement on timeliness, efficiency, and effectiveness of disaster preparedness and relief programs are much needed to strengthen local capacity to protect vulnerable livelihoods and assets, acquire skills on utilization of data, information and technology to improve early warning system and early action, and build disaster-ready communities. Next slide, please. Last year, Oxfam Pilipinas, in partnership with Humanity and Inclusion, People's Disaster Risk Reduction Network, Initiatives for Dialogue Empowerment through Alternative Legal Services, and the community organizers Multiversity piloted a project on strengthening urban preparedness through preemptive action in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao. This project began its implementation in June of last year with funding support from the European Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid Operation. Next slide, please. The project aims to improve disaster preparedness and contribute to the reduction of vulnerability of highly at-risk communities in the cities of Cotabato and Marawi, and now with expansion in the cities of Kidapawan. Next slide, please. Investing in disaster risk reduction and preparedness yields multiple benefits, starting with saving lives, minimizing economic losses, and reducing infrastructure damage. Unfortunately, although critically needed for disaster-prone country like ours in the Philippines, disaster preparedness that focuses on prevention, anticipation, and local capacities development for better and quicker anticipatory responses is woefully underfunded. Until now, cash programming has been used primarily reactively for recovery rather than proactively for preparedness and resilience. For this project, we decided to change that. Next slide, please. By combining three innovative approaches, the use of impact-based and risk forecasting model and financial technologies to save lives and protect livelihoods, increase preparedness and mitigate disaster risk through enabling pre-disaster cash transfers, and combined with Sharia-compliant digital financial platform that will also usher financial inclusion to the most vulnerable communities in these urban areas in Mindanao. Based on smart data on early warning system, our local government partners, with support from the project, can immediately and safely deliver cash prior to a flooding episode. Most vulnerable households in flood-prone communities receive cash and disaster preparedness training as a preparedness measure before the impact of flooding, allowing households to effectively protect and prepare themselves and minimize the impact of floods and other recurrent hazards. Next slide, please. This project is an innovative partnership between Oxfam, the private sector, government, local NGOs, and science-based agencies to support the needs of flood-prone communities to better prepare and enable early action for anticipation aid. Next slide, please. To prepare communities for anticipatory action before the flood, households in flood-prone areas underwent disaster preparedness workshop. Next slide, please. And financial literacy training before receiving a Visa prepaid card in preparation for typhoon and flooding season. Next slide, please. This project aims to protect vulnerable families from damage and losses brought by floods through the use of latest digital forecasting technologies that can measure the impact of incoming flood. When the indicator signals the likelihood of a flooding episode striking a given community, an electronic cash transfer is automatically triggered through the digital financial service platform, and the community received cash straight on their Visa prepaid card. Next slide, please. No more long queuing to distribute the cash assistance. The money will automatically go to their prepaid accounts, safe and fast. The families are then able to use the money to prepare for the incoming hazard, like flooding. Depending on their needs, they can choose to reinforce their homes, purchase emergency food, water, or medical supplies, or evacuate to families to safer location. The prepaid cards provided to households can be downloaded with cash multiple times, not only by government or by Oxfam, but by other agencies who want to provide top-up support to flood-prone communities. But most important of all, vulnerable families themselves can save money on their cards and prepare for the next flood and other hazards. That's next slide, please. Such is the power of combining forecasting data to release cash assistance before a disaster strikes, utilizing a digital financial platform that also facilitates an entry point to financial inclusion. Allow me to end this presentation by reiterating that climate change will continue to make our humanitarian work increasingly hard, unpredictable, and complex, affecting more people and requiring more resources than in previous decades. Thus, the urgent need to further strengthen and expand our anticipatory approaches and continue to work with diverse stakeholders like climate scientists, science-based agencies, together with the communities to help improve our ability to project seasonal climate outlooks for the most vulnerable. Lessons from our flood anticipatory action confirm that to institutionalize anticipatory action and make it more sustainable, policy and infrastructure barriers must be addressed, including digitalizing flood data, better connectivity for local governments, especially in hazard-prone communities, and local governments being able to use their disaster reduction management funds for anticipatory action. There is also the critical role of social preparation and local leadership, involving more communities and building local government capacity, such that they can lead and sustain the process. Last slide, please. Let me end by sharing a quote from our country director, Lot Felisko, who said that the success of anticipatory action as an innovation will be marked by how it is scaled out, scaled up, and scaled deep, or by its reach and policy behavioral impacts. Achieving this will, of course, take time, and thus, our sustained collective investment is critically needed. Thank you and good day to all. Over to you, Anna.
Many thanks, Rhoda.
Yeah, thank you, Rhoda. That was a lovely note to end on our collective investment in this agenda. So thank you so much for that presentation. Sadly, we are over time and out of time, so we don't have room for discussion right now, but I've seen that there are quite a few questions in the chat. We will be collecting those and trying to get the answers to you. We will share those with the minutes as well. As I said at the start, we will stay on the line for any questions that you may have, but just to say a huge thank you to all of our speakers today. That varied range of presentations has been incredibly insightful. So thank you once again for joining us, and thank you to everybody for participating, for sending your questions, your thoughts and ideas. We'll hope to see you at the next FOREWARN.